So, you want to know just how dumb Matt Powell can actually be. I mean, you can just go look at any of his numerous videos and watch the gray matter just drip out of his ears, but this one is a peach. So, if you ever wondered just how dumb Matt Powell is, here's your answer. And it's even dumber than you thought. So, this is kind of an odd one, and I wanted to explain it up front. Someone sent me a video from another YouTube atheist who was going over this video and suggested that I might want to take a look. So I did, and I decided that, yeah, I wanted to do it, but by the time I got over to Matt Powell's original video, he'd taken it down. Now, I don't know if that's permanent or just temporary, but at the time I went to grab it, it was just gone, so I had to take this out of another person's video, and therefore I don't know if I have everything that Matt said or not. I have no way of knowing. I can't go verify. Sorry. So, my apologies if this isn't precisely in context, because so far as I know, the original just isn't available anymore. Anyway, we're going to go do a Matt Powell video, and it's just stupid, just like Matt is. I think that's the only real setup that you need.
So from generation to generation, as we accumulate genetic mutations, we actually accumulate 1 to 200 genetic mutations, or what's known as neutral mutations, per person per generation.
Okay, so what? Because here's the problem that Matt is going to have. He has no clue what the hell he's actually talking about. And I know that's no surprise, but it becomes really problematic because he's all over the place. And keep in mind, this is the guy who believes that in the Civil War, they were actually out there shooting pterodactyls.
I believe if we study history, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls, back in the Civil War, and they spread these things out. Anybody can look it up online. They spread these things out, and this is a historical fact.
So you're going to have to ask yourself just how much value there is in anything that Matt Powell actually believes. Because here's the problem with people like Matt. They're idiots. And I mean, they really are, and there's no denying the fact. Matt doesn't actually give a damn because, as we all know, the religious just don't care if anything in their heads is actually true or not, so long as they get that dopamine drip in the brain. So this kind of tells you what you're in for. But it does get worse. A lot worse.
And so what that means is that our offspring will have 1 to 200 typographical errors that we did not have in our genetics.
So here's the point where I think Matt goes completely off the reservation. He assumes, apparently because he does this numerous times in the video, but he clearly assumes that humanity has a specific baseline that represents perfection. And any changes from that baseline somehow means failure of some sort. So Matt completely misunderstands, well, everything. He has no clue about genetics, reproduction, or pretty much anything else, and that's not really a surprise, is it? Because Matt is a moron. All of these people are. He moved in with Kent Hovind, mostly, I think, because Kent's YouTube channel got suspended and he had to have somewhere to post his crap. But if there's anyone dumber than Kent, and that's kind of hard to believe, but if there is, it's Matt Powell. They're just two peas in a pod. Stupid and laughable.
And so population geneticists have all come to the conclusion that our genetics are actually deteriorating as we move on and as time progresses.
Citation needed, because that is utter nonsense. Maybe the so-called scientists on your side, but they wouldn't last in an actual scientific setting for any length of time, which is really why they don't work there. they don't do anything useful. They just sit around and pontificate on their own blind faith, and they just make crap up because it makes them happy. So no, legitimate scientists aren't doing anything of the sort, and if Matt and his idiot brigade would like to prove otherwise, they just have to trot out their evidence. Oh right, they don't have any of that, do they? And science doesn't care about anything but. The evidence is all, and they have none. And that's why he's making these videos for theists and not scientists. Because scientists would eat him alive.
As we reproduce, our genetics become worse over time as a population.
Yeah, not so much. Because there is no such thing as better or worse in this context. There is absolutely nothing against which we can measure better or worse. We are what we are. This is where people like Matt, because he's certainly not alone in this, but this is where he loses himself in the things that he already believes, because he's already convinced, for bad reasons, that man started out perfect and has, since then, started to degrade. So he just pushes that on everyone else because, as we all know, everybody has to be just like Matt, right? Except Matt is a complete moron and hopefully the rest of us aren't. He's just not bright enough to figure that out.
And so genetic entropy is something that evolutionists and atheists will often mock and say that it's a ridiculous idea that our genes could be deteriorating. But I'm sorry, if you have 1 to 200 typographical errors per person per generation, I mean, that over time is going to accumulate in the genetic pool and cause us to literally go extinct.
Now, let me remind you that Matt is talking about neutral mutations here. Neutral. You know, those things that have absolutely zero impact on survivability by definition. So it is literally impossible for a neutral mutation, and that's what he's talking about. He keeps saying it, but it is impossible for a neutral mutation to have any bearing on our success or our failure in the biological race. It can't happen, but of course, that would assume that Matt actually cares about reality, which I think we can all conclude that he really doesn't. He doesn't understand what these words mean, nor does he care. He's just desperately trying to get to his emotionally comforting conclusion, whether it makes any kind of sense or not. Because who needs sense when you've got faith, right?
Population geneticists know that these errors that are accumulating will have some effect, even if that effect is vanishingly small.
Again, citation needed. You can't just say this stuff and not back any of it up. But let's assume that, for the sake of argument and to be very charitable, let's assume that he's right. So what? Because Matt completely misunderstands genetics. Yes, all mutations have some effect, large or small, but he's chosen to focus on neutral mutations, and that means that any effect that they might have, regardless of size, regardless of scope, they cannot affect survival positively or negatively. So what difference does it make? Because here's one place that I want you to keep an eye out for, because it comes up again later, but apparently Matt wants offspring to be genetic clones of their parents. If you're not identical to your parents, then there's something wrong. Now, I get why he thinks that, again, because he wants to believe that humans are all made in the image of his imaginary friend, but reality doesn't work that way. We don't have 7 billion identical clones on the planet. Even someone as stupid as Matt Powell ought to be able to figure that one out.
So all mutations, all errors in the human genome must have some effect on fitness.
Except you've already said that you're talking about neutral mutations, which by definition don't. And don't think I'm going to let you away from that. This is your video I'm responding to. I'm not making this shit up. But did you catch what else he said? He's thinking of these things as errors, as though there must be a right way for gene replication to occur and anything else is wrong. Except again, that's just not how actual reality functions. But Matt and his ilk don't live in the real world, do they? They live in a magical fantasy land in their heads where the real world and the real world ideas don't intrude. And it's why he gets absolutely everything that he says completely wrong. Because he's got no clue at all.
And so, in 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed, and they found as well that we lose 1 to 2% of our genetic information as human beings per generation.
Yeah, no they didn't. We don't lose anything. Some things might fall out of our genome, but other things pop up to replace it. Mutation is both an additive and a subtractive thing. Traits that help out with our survival, they tend to stick around, and those that don't, those tend to be edited out. As individuals with the best adapted genes, they tend to reproduce more, and those with the least adapted genes, they tend to reproduce less, if at all. Welcome to basic evolution, Matt. It's really not that hard to understand.
So our offspring is losing genetic information as time moves on. Mutations are accumulating in the genetic code, and this is causing us to go extinct as a population.
Yeah, how is that exactly? Because worldwide, we average 140 million new births every single year compared to about 55 million deaths. In 1900, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. Today, we're sitting right around 7.7 billion. In 2015, there were approximately 43 million more people born worldwide than there were in 1950. That's not extinction, Matt. Do you even know what the word means? Because as time goes on, we're getting more people, not less. And I think this is yet another term that he just doesn't understand. And that's hardly a surprise, is it?
There are scientific papers that have been written about why we should have been extinct 100 times over, if evolution were even true.
Let's see some of those, because I've never seen a one. Now, yes, there are some things that have happened that, yes, they could have caused our extinction. I don't think any of them have to do with evolution, but yeah, by all means, prove me wrong. Asteroid impacts, radiation spikes, cosmic events of all sorts, yes, those absolutely do happen and can wipe us out. You get a good gamma ray burst aimed right at us and we're toast. But that's not evolution. That's something else, and I figure that Matt here doesn't have the slightest clue what the hell he's talking about, because these people don't tend to, and that's the problem. It's why, if you talk to a creationist, they tend to think that Big Bang cosmology and biological evolution are the same damn thing, because these people are idiots.
And so, the way that evolutionists try to rescue this is by invoking natural selection. But the problem is that natural selection cannot detect neutral mutations.
Matt, natural selection can't detect anything. It's not alive. It's not self-aware. It's basic chemistry doing things that chemicals do. But he doesn't know any of that, so I guess that's hardly a surprise. And I know he keeps using the word evolutionist like it means anything, but yeah, okay, I guess it does. It means he's an idiot. Because these are things that only exist in their tiny little minds. Like, all the crap in the Bible. It's just not real. But, okay, what else is new?
So these 100 to 200 typographical errors in our bodies that get passed on from generation to generation cannot be detected by natural selection and therefore cannot be weeded out.
But if you're talking about neutral mutations, and remember, I'm going to keep your feet to the fire here because you made this point yourself, but neutral mutations, they don't need to be weeded out because they're not doing anything harmful by definition. They're just sitting there doing nothing until either the environment changes and they become either beneficial or detrimental, or other mutations come along that in concert let them do something either useful or harmful. And again, he's just looking at the human genome as if there was a point at which it was perfect, and everything since then has been slipping into imperfection, which simply isn't true. He's trying to smuggle in his theology, and it just doesn't work that way. When I say that these people need to be able to take a few steps back and stop thinking theologically and start thinking logically, this is exactly what I mean. And Matt can't do it. And that's really why he's such a joke.
Natural selection only selects and removes the genes that are most deleterious.
But these are neutral mutations that aren't deleterious at all. I'm just going with what you said, don't blame me. Because if they were deleterious, those with better, more beneficial genes would reproduce faster and would wipe out those with the quote-unquote bad genes. Because that's how natural selection works. Those more fit to survive within a certain ecological niche produce more offspring than those less fit. The good genes go on and the bad genes do not. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, but when you're talking to somebody on the level of Matt Powell, you got to explain it like he's 5. And even that goes right over his head.
It might enhance your best beneficial mutation and might remove the worst deleterious mutation, but the neutral mutations are completely invisible to natural selection. Selection cannot act upon them.
So he's just confirming that he's still talking about neutral mutations. I didn't want anyone to think that he'd changed his mind somewhere in the middle there and was going off on another tangent. Because here's the thing, Matt. A neutral mutation doesn't need natural selection to act upon it. It's not hurting anything. It's not making things more fit. It's not making things less fit. It's just kind of sitting there doing nothing important. And he keeps coming back to it as though he can't get it through his thick skull just how dumb all of this is. Because it is. Because he is.
And so natural selection has its limits. And so for evolutionists to claim that natural selection is what's causing us to select beneficial mutations, and those beneficial mutations make us better over time, well, even if that were the case, we're still getting 100 to 200 neutral mutations or typographical errors in our genetics that are building up along with those beneficial mutations, even if you were to grant their argument. And so errors over time will cause death.
No, they won't. Detrimental errors over time, to use his terminology, would cause death. It isn't necessarily true in every case, but it certainly could be. Yet so long as there are more beneficial mutations than detrimental ones, we continue to go on, and the neutral mutations have absolutely nothing at all to do with any of it, at least not individually. Collectively, maybe, if they interact and either become beneficial or detrimental, but that's not what he's talking about here, so we're not going to go into that. Actually, I've got no idea what the hell he's talking about because this guy is all over the map.
So for evolutionists to claim that natural selection is going to preserve us as a population,
we don't need to be preserved. Oh, I know that a lot of people get really attached to the idea of human survival. That doesn't actually mean anything in the real world, though. We either survive or we don't. Other animals, they either survive or they don't. There's nothing there to preserve us outside of the cold, calculating reality that we all actually live in. We're not special, no matter how much some people really, really wish that we were. We're just insignificant animals on an insignificant planet in an insignificant solar system on the rim of an insignificant galaxy. One of billions and billions in, so far as we can tell, an entirely insignificant universe. We just don't matter to anybody but ourselves. And when we're gone, as every species inevitably does, nobody's gonna miss us. The overwhelming majority of the universe, if there's anybody else out there at all, but nobody is even gonna know we were here. Maybe some alien archaeologists are gonna go, that's funny, there was somebody that used to live here. They're not gonna give a damn. They just won't. Welcome to reality, Matt. Go cry your tears elsewhere.
when natural selection cannot even detect these deleterious mutations that are getting added to the genetic pool,
Wait a minute, did you just shift gears again? Because you're supposed to be talking about neutral mutations, not deleterious ones. I don't know that you know the difference between the two, because natural selection can detect those, just to use your terminology, which still isn't accurate, but we'll just let that fly. Because the second it is detrimental, that's when natural selection operates on it. That's how natural selection works. Honestly, is Matt just opening his mouth and having random words fall out and just hoping they make some kind of sense? Because he's wrong. They don't. And this is a question that I've been asking a lot lately, but if anybody's been watching some of the videos over at the atheist community of Austin, do these people not know just how much of a dumbass they look like? Are they not aware? When they call in, do they not understand what a complete fool they're making of themselves? Because it's really hard for me to get it through my head that these people who clearly have no clue what the hell they're talking about could be so absurdly stupid not to realize that they don't know what the hell they're talking about. This is the epitome of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And Matt here, he's not just the spokesman, he's a client.
It just goes to show that this crowd, these YouTube atheists, are the most scientifically illiterate people that exist. And just the fact that they could believe in Big Bang cosmology or that pond scum turned a human over time.
Matt, you're just looking in the mirror again, and I think we all realize that the religious do this all the time. These are the people who keep saying that we believe that something came from nothing when that's their theology. That's their position. It's not ours. Because again, clearly we can't be any different than they are, right? We actually have to agree with them. We just have to want to sin or some other stupid bullshit like that. They can't understand that we have nothing at all in common with them. We are nothing like they are. And that's why they spend so much time with ridiculous straw men of what we actually think, or what they think we actually think, or what they've convinced themselves that we must actually think, or the out-of-focus copies of their own beliefs that they just arbitrarily assign to us because we can't be any different than they are. I don't know what to tell you. These people are just dumb.
Or fish turn to fishermen over time, or bacteria to biologists. This proves that these people cannot be trusted. Because people that actually use free thought and that can do scientific empirical methods will not come to such ridiculous conclusions that the world popped into existence from nothing with no cause associated with it.
Isn't that you? Oh right, you just invented a supposed cause out of whole cloth, but you're just making a complete fool of yourself when you pretend that you've got it all right with no evidence or anything, and reject any actual objective science because it doesn't stroke your pathetic ego. And here, he's just left the reservation once again because he's off into Big Bang cosmology, which has absolutely nothing at all to do with evolution. Now, granted, Matt and his ilk don't understand that, nor do they care, but that just proves once again the kind of mental problems that people like Matt Powell actually have. Because he's just throwing crap at the wall in hopes that something will stick, that the people who he wants to watch, the people who are just as dumb as he is, that they're just going to gobble up his god jizz because they're only after the same kind of emotionally coddling crap that he is. And hopefully some of them will just give him some money. Because Matt has absolutely no worthwhile skills otherwise. I mean, this is the guy who, before he moved in with Kent Hovind, he worked in a church as a visitation director. You know, he was in charge of bothering you by banging on your door on Sunday morning. Because Matt Powell is an asshole.
I mean, folks, this stuff is absolutely pathetic on absolutely every level. And as creationists, we should constantly be calling them out. And one of the favorite talking points that I've found that are out there on our side is that we gain these genetic mutations and that they cannot be weeded out by natural selection. That is proof positive that we started out perfect as a genetic species and then we became worse over time.
Well, some of us did, clearly, But we've come back around to his emotionally comforting conclusion that comes not from fact, but from faith. He doesn't really care if it's true. It makes him happy, and that's all that matters. And I find it funny that he acknowledges that it's absolutely pathetic on every level, but he can't see that the side that's pathetic is his. He just doesn't care about that. He doesn't care that everyone with a clue is just pointing at him and laughing. Nobody takes him seriously except those that have fallen for his con. Matt isn't even bright enough to know that he's part of a con. Now, I'm not sure if Hovind is either, but either way, I figure Matt is just being used. And he's happy to be used. He's happy to dance like a trained monkey on YouTube and make a complete fool of himself. Because for somebody with Matt Powell's obviously limited mental skills, what else can he do?
Not a single cell becoming better over time, but the human population being created perfectly in the beginning and then becoming worse over time.
Except that's not at all what we see in the real world. That's not what the evidence shows. That's not what the observation demonstrates to be true. Granted, he couldn't care less about any of that. He's just rationalizing as fast as he can to get back to his feel-good theology, and if he has to lie and bleach his brain to keep the feel-good chemicals going, well, he's only too happy to do that. And you wonder why I call religion a mind poison. This is why.
And so even if we granted evolution to be true, if there was a single-celled organism at the beginning, which all life descended from, that single-celled organism would have just reproduced worse copies of itself, and it would have died out as it accumulated mutations.
Because Matt doesn't understand basic biology. Or much of anything else, but let's focus on the biology for the moment. Nothing improves if it just stays the same. Mutations are not necessarily bad. He wants to think they are because he's desperately trying to maintain his religious beliefs that don't actually mean anything worthwhile in the real world. But the second that you actually look at these things objectively, we find that those are not remotely in line with actual reality. Not that he gives a shit about that or anything, because he doesn't, but Matt really just wishes that it was true. Now, I don't know if Matt here was homeschooled or if he attained this level of stupidity all on his own, but this is another reason never to allow religion to fill the heads of innocent children with complete religious crap. Absolutely nothing that he's saying has anything to do with the real world. He's living in his own little fantasy world and hiding from anything that could tell him otherwise. Because he just doesn't care. And that's sad, isn't it?
And so, natural selection only selects information that exists. It doesn't create new information, it simply selects. Hence the name natural selection. So, even if you had a single-celled organism at the beginning, like I said, it would have copied worse versions of itself.
Matt, you do know that natural selection is a mechanism, but it's not the only mechanism involved in evolution, right? Oh, wait, he doesn't know that. He doesn't know anything. Because better and worse are irrelevant when it comes to basic biology. There are no objective standards here. I know you wish that there were, but you're just wrong. Natural selection can only operate on what actually exists. But what exists, through mutation in this case, has nothing to do with making a better creature. There are no better creatures. There are just better fitted creatures. It just happens that way. Whether that creature continues to survive or not depends entirely on the environment and the other candidates within the ecological niche. But that's just too hard for somebody like Matt to comprehend. He'd rather pretend, well, God done it.
Think about it. Nobody would ever go to a copying machine and say that the copy is better than the original.
Because nature isn't a copying machine, Matt. Copies don't mutate. They don't adapt to their environment. This is just more stupidity on Matt's part because he doesn't really care. He just wants to con the rubes and convince them that the stupid garbage in his head sounds somehow reasonable. And I'm sorry, Matt, but it just doesn't. because you're a dumbass.
But according to evolution, the copy, yeah, that's way better than the original.
Says the guy who doesn't understand evolution or basic biology. This whole thing really is ridiculous the second that you think about it. This is another place where, if I was still doing my shallow end of the gene pool playlist, Matt would always end up there. In fact, as I've gotten older and more critical and a little bit less charitable toward the bullshit, it's hard to find a single theist anywhere that probably wouldn't go there, because they just aren't impressive in any way. It's just that people like Matt here, they're so absurdly simple to take apart and prove that they haven't got a clue and that they don't give a damn whatsoever whether they do or not. This is all just fifis and faith, no evidence and no concern if any of it makes any sense whatsoever. There are videos on him and Kent Hovind sitting around making complete and utter fools of themselves, and anybody with a high school level of knowledge on anything in the biological sciences would be rolling their eyes at just how dumb it all is. Granted, their audience, their intended audience, they don't have that. They've had their heads filled with this religious bullshit since day one, and therefore smarts aren't required. In fact, they're kind of frowned upon. So anyway, what did you think? Is this as dumb as I said it would be, or is it even worse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Once again, I'm sorry that I couldn't go back to his original video because, at least as I make this thing, it's just gone. I just went and looked again to make sure, and yep, nothing at all. So I guess he's trying to hide from the rational people who are pointing out just how dumb that he is. And this is nothing new. He's done this before. Because this is your brain on religion, folks. Don't do this to yourself. You can be so much better than Matt Powell. Because if you think about it, it's kind of hard to be worse.
I believe if we study history, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls, back in the Civil War, and they spread these things out. Anybody can look it up online. There's so much.